so happy right now. Hello, everyone. How you doing? Let's try one more time. It's the end of the day. This is the last session. Let's get that energy up. How's everyone doing? Good. Yes. Yes. That's much better. Man, speaking of hair, I got it all over my mouth. That little swoopy thing just gets it everywhere. Okay, so something that we're going to do today is really fun for me. We're going to do a Q&A panel. And I want to bring everyone out. It looks like we're all set up. I'm super excited about this. For about 3 years, I got to host a show called React Podcast, where I talked with a lot of people about React. If you were like, I kind of recognize that guy's voice, but he sounds drunk, you probably listen to React Podcast at 2x. So today we're going to do a 1x version of that. It'll be much slower, but it'll also be a lot of fun. We got the React team. You've seen a lot of them give beautiful talks already. Let's give them a round of applause real quick. Now, my goal today is to ask some questions that you might have asked, but I've run a number of meetups, and I know that y'all ask bad questions. The mean ones get to the microphone first, and then people just start talking about their own applications and the businesses that they're building. Like, it gets pretty tiresome. So I want to represent you, though, and so hopefully I've compiled a list of questions that will represent your interests and some of the questions that you may have had from these talks. And so I hope I did a good job, and we'll find out. So we got everybody here? Let's start this off. All right. Okay, so the first one is for Lauren. How you doing?
Hello.
Hello. So I want to talk about the compiler a little bit. Right around the time that React came out, Elm also kind of came out, and because it was a language, it had some really world-class developer experiences. The compiler errors were really great, and I think a lot of people were like, well, how do we get something like that in something kind of smaller, focused like React? And so I'm curious, in the compiler, in your work on the compiler, where are some areas where you and your team have really sweat the details to provide a great DX? And did Elm and things like Svelte have a role in kind of shaping what that looked like?
Yeah, I think our team definitely takes the developer experience of using the compiler very seriously. And we spent a bunch of time making sure, just even things like, where does the red line appear? Like, does it appear at the call site where you call it? Where at the declaration? There's like a lot of little details to figure out. And I don't know if we looked at any particular library or package or language for inspiration, but I think, I can't speak for the whole team, but I think a lot of us are like Rust fans. So definitely, I think the Rust compiler with its diagnostics is a huge inspiration for us. And something I also know from the Elm, they have a lot of focus on error messages for humans. So I think we still have a ways to go, but I think we've tried our best to make the error messages very readable and actionable. Anything that isn't actionable, we kind of we don't report it yet. And so we still, correctly detect errors, but if we don't feel like the error message meets our bar for what is a reportable message, we just kind of not report it yet.
Awesome. Now, Joe, I wanted to follow up with you on that, because I know in our conversations you've said that you had to hit a surprising amount of granularity in order to even hope to provide messages that were helpful, where the squiggly line, where does the squiggly line go? What has that looked like, that path looked like in developing a React compiler?
Yeah, so the way we develop the compiler is we actually have an allow list of syntax that we support. So we sort of, we started with basic JavaScript features, if else, for loops, variable declarations, and then kind of gradually expanded the syntax that we support. And so over time, we started, finding, okay, everything kind of works. We got to go out, push to more and more of our code base in order to actually find errors. Yeah, it's been, which is exactly what you want, right? And so I think, I don't know.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I have some more. So we're gonna actually flip sides. This is actually kind of funny. Like
a little bit of an awkward setup. But despite the staging, we actually work very closely together. This is not like a symbolic thing that we tried to set up here.
Vercel on one
We're
side,
just gonna randomize
Meta on
every
the
once in a
other.
while.
Jason, this one's for you. So I know that there are a lot of existing kind of nuisances in React syntax right now. And so like one of those might be like SVG. There's some like trouble around like self-closing tags, class, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder, the first part of my question is, do you think it's possible to address some of those maybe long-standing issues at a compiler level? So that's question number one. And then kind of in the second place is, well, you might not want to give secrets out about the future. What does it look like? What are some classifications of things that you see us maybe bringing into a compiler for React? Some problems that we can solve maybe in the future?
Yeah, sure. I can take a step at that. And then I think the team can probably weigh in. I think, yes, I think it's definitely, our decision to step into a compiler is not unprecedented, right? Like, we've seen people in the industry do this in multiple frameworks. We actually also, within Meta, we've been doing this for a while too. We have a concentration of folks who have developed compiler expertise or who came in with compiler expertise. We build a relay compiler in-house to take GraphQL template literals and generate artifacts out of them. And I think jumping to a compiler model does like unlock a whole range of capabilities, from syntax to like things that affect the whole programming model. I think you asked about like what are some of those things. Gosh, I think we're really excited to explore them. As we've been going through this process, beginning with memoization, which I do think is just kind of one, tackling render performance, this one specific part of render performance, which happens to be a pretty big DX pain point, at least for us. I think we've gotten glimpses of a bunch of other things that make us question, like, oh yeah, could we take a look at effects? Maybe we're taking some things for granted here, or actually maybe there's some room to make this much less painful. Maybe it's the dependencies are right, or maybe we can look at state or refs or context. Like, all of this stuff I think is up for the compiler to optimize, improve, and ultimately I think we try to approach problems not just from this like super narrow view. Instead, we take a broader, like, can we build this? Can we invest in something that's really a foundation? Not just a single like one little trick that gets rid of use memo or something like that. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought I saw a hand off. Yeah, please. Yeah. This is such a weird position. Is there someone behind me? Did someone say something? Go ahead.
Come out to the cool couch. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Sorry. Trying to think of a real answer now. The compiler is really a foundation, and what we're shipping today is really just the first sort of feature. So I think about it like we have a really solid foundation in the compiler, and it is not only about auto-memoization, it is a compiler that deeply understands React. So we gave a demo 3 years ago of something that was really just focused on attempting to do auto-memoization. And what we realized is we had to, in order to make that work, we had to understand your code at a much deeper level. And so we actually went back about 2 years ago and rewrote the compiler from the ground up based on everything we'd learned up until that point. And that is what is shipping today. And so now with that much deeper understanding, we're able to do auto-memoization, but we can also do more things on top of that. So one thing we've talked about is shipping an ability to call context or hooks from inside use memo callbacks, where you could have more fine-grained access, so that, for example, today, if a component accesses context, well, whenever that context changes, the component will re-render. But you might just be grabbing one kind of tiny slice of the context. With the compiler, we are going to, if that piece hasn't changed, we'll quickly bail out and it'll get an optimization. But we could go further and actually figure out, what, the context changed, but we can just figure out, we don't need to do anything in this component at all, which would obviously be even better. And so that's a case where we can start to say, does this even need to be an API? Or could this just be an optimization that you never have to think about? React just works faster out of the box. So that's where I think it really starts to change things, where do we even need an API? But that's not ready yet, coming in the future.
You got some people really excited just now. Yeah, give it up, give it up. Fewer APIs, we love it.
Michael,
Yes.
do you mind if I just want to praise the team who implemented the compiler real quick? And I can say that because I wasn't one of them. But I watched very closely the whole time along. And I'm going to suggest to anyone who hasn't done this already to go to the compiler playground. What's the URL again? It's like playground.react.dev. And you can type in some React code and see the compiled output. But I'm going to encourage you to do that because you don't just see the compiled JavaScript output. You can see all of the compiler passes that's happening under the hood. And not that it's important to know all of that stuff, but it's just really a testament, I think, to how much impressive engineering work went into this project. And also, to the question, I think it really gives you a sense of the potential of this kind of tool, given just how much the compiler is already able to infer from your React code. And I think with your imaginations, you don't need for us to really tell you what's coming. You can probably guess it, what some of those might be.
And possibly from some of your tweets, maybe. All right, Mofei, I have one for you, actually. So this is, as I was watching your presentation this morning, I was just getting, memories of like when I first saw React and the React Virtual DOM, and this idea that we could have write declarative UI, and it would just handle all of those insertions for us and do it with like great efficiency. And so I want to talk with you about the sentiment around, I guess, giving up control over performance. Because I can imagine that many of us in this room feel this sense of loss almost, as we have learned a very hard thing. And we love to hold on to hard things and just feel like, that's mine, I earned it. And so I'm curious, like, what has sentiment been like as you've rolled this out? Have people felt positively about it? Have there been things that people didn't feel positively about?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think the sentiment's been overwhelmingly positive. In fact, I think manual memoization isn't just tedious, it's pretty error-prone. So in the past, we've seen like production level sevs come out of somebody writing a use memo and later kind of editing that value after the memo call. And we found a couple of these cases as well when rolling out the compiler. I think in general, developers are pretty relieved to kind of give up control in this sense because it's not something that people really should be thinking about and worrying about maintaining. I also want to talk about a little bit of the work that the Flow team has been doing at Meta to use compiler inference and kind of this new framework, programming model framework, to enable better type errors and type annotations in Flow. So we've been thinking about how maybe functions passed to use effect might differ from functions used in render, for example. And I think there will be more kind of developer experience related work coming in the future. And I think that's really exciting because it's not really APIs that developers have to learn, but it's really like IDE extensions where it's like, oh, you might be using this in a slightly suboptimal way where this looks like you're doing something wrong. Like, are you sure you want to do this in an effect or not?
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, and can be for anyone, in that experience, I know that we've had a lot of ESLint rules up to this point, and that's kind of directed us up to a point. Now we can kind of get a little bit more fine-grained and like get into areas that we haven't been able to get into before. Does that change the developer experience? Like, does it like take it out of the editor, or like what's the workflow for that? Like, does it feel the same? Is it kind of like the same thing at the end of the day?
We expect it to feel the same, but it's very much work in progress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Ricky, I'm going to pick on you for a second because I saw a tweet about this. So there was some concern immediately around the fact that this is announced as a Babel plugin. And so I saw a tweet of you saying like, hey, no, there's like, this is just the way you connect to the compiler. Tell us a little bit about kind of what we might be able to expect in terms of integrations long term.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because on the Dark Place, I saw a lot of like, oh, it's just a Babel plugin. It's absolutely not just a Babel plugin. It is an actual compiler, and what we published today were Babel bindings to make it easy to adopt in existing apps. So you can imagine an alternative where we would have shipped like a whole command that you would need to run in a separate process, separate from your developer server. That would kind of not be great. And maybe we'll have that eventually, and maybe we can build that out. But what we have now is a compiler runtime that has Babel bindings, and we're able to add other bindings for like SWC, so you can adopt it into more apps and more pipelines. So what we want to make it do is make it as easy to adopt as possible. It's one of the React principles of gradual migration and gradual adoption, so that everybody can try it out and get all the value and benefits of it without coming in like really hard with changing your entire pipeline.
Awesome. I love that. I think that'll probably set a lot of us at ease who are thinking like, do we have to go back to Babel to get the cool stuff?
Yeah, so one thing just to add on. So we obviously know that some folks are using other tools like SWC, tools that are written in Rust. So sometimes having to even enable a Babel plugin at all might slow down your build. So definitely aware of that. If you look in the repo, we've actually started porting the compiler to Rust. So you can expect that over time.
Yeah, give it up. Give it up for Rust.
Rust.
Yeah,
Rust fans. All right.
Got some crustaceans in here. Let's go.
That's kind of currently on pause while we're just continuing to get the compiler to be, it's experimental, so we want to work through some more things. But definitely it's on our radar to look at. And of course, that would still be, we want to have, in that world, it would be Rust, but still exported as a Babel plugin so that if you are using Babel, you can still just drop it in and run.
I want to push on the compiler thing because I think something that's interesting about React's history is that there's been this, since the beginning, a very symbiotic relationship with compilers. So like first with Babel and then later with TypeScript. I'm curious, what does it look like kind of now that there is a React compiler, like to integrate with those types of things? Like is that something that will just be like handled eventually, or is that something that we'll always kind of have to, like, does it put TypeScript in like a secondary position if you're using TypeScript to compile your JSX? Is that a weird question? Did I fully misunderstand it?
I can answer it.
TSX.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll. So, right, like today, you have TypeScript running and checking your code, right? Usually, some folks use TypeScript directly to compile. Others will just use TypeScript just for checking, and then use Babel for the actual compilation. So that really doesn't change.
Got it.
Yeah. So
okay, cool,
yeah,
perfect.
For example, you'd have the TypeScript running in your IDE, also having our ESLint plugin running in the IDE, and they just work together. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I think one of the things that you see with these tools as they evolve is when the more that they mature, the more everything starts to integrate together. Yeah. And so it's going to be kind of just a Babel plugin right now, but it'll the whole ecosystem will start to integrate it into more tools, and it'll be more seamless.
Awesome. Love it. All right, so we're gonna move kind of off of compiler as the main topic, and so I can actually like sit on this side of the room for a second. Josh, I want to start with you. So you showed us some really cool stuff in the way that React 19 is introducing some new niceties around HTML, which I'm super excited about as someone who loves HTML. I'm curious, why now? So we've seen, we've had React Helmet kind of doing a similar type of thing since the very beginning of React. And I'm curious, were there APIs that we needed that didn't exist up until this release to be able to do this effectively? And I guess, were there any surprises that you found in bringing that into the framework?
Sure. I think that there were some things that are kind of new in React 18 that sort of changed the dynamic. So streaming is one of them. We didn't do streaming before that. And so, I tried to highlight in my two talks, why that's challenging, because we have this tension between sending something to the browser as fast as possible, but also knowing the whole state of an application and being able to kind of reorder things and whatnot. So before, you just render the entire thing and you wait until it's finished, and then you're like, oh, these are all the style sheets. I can just like send those first or whatever. So that's new. But I think that the other thing that's like important to convey is that, and I hope this came through in the talks, like we don't just like solve preloading or solve style sheets or solve metadata. Like they all interplay with each other. And so shipping just one of these things isn't good enough, I guess. Like we could have done the work over time and maybe we would have like kept it behind a flag and it's on the experimental release or whatever. But when we ship it, we want it to be useful kind of broadly. And we don't just look at each of these in isolation, they're kind of coordinated. Suspense is another kind of component of this where the whole style sheet solution wouldn't even work if we didn't have suspense. So we only have had suspense, at least like the real suspense, since React 18 as well. And I know that like 2.5 years is a long time for a release. It's not like we like ship majors super quickly, but one major after we started utilizing these features in some of the the new HTML coordination stuff. So it's partly just like the philosophy of shipping something coherent that's really well integrated, and part of it's that like we live in a different environment now. We have this new capability, and it introduces potentially a new challenge, and we want to kind of help smooth that over and provide the best of both worlds. Oh, and I guess for surprising things that I learned, I guess I knew CSS was hard, but like, I really know that it's hard now. Way more than maybe I thought I wanted to before I started doing this work. And I'm not even talking about like making things look pretty. I'm not good at that. I just mean like kind of coordinating it within a browser environment. So, TIL.
Yeah, I like that. It went from like head knowledge that CSS is hard to heart knowledge. Yeah. I feel that. And then, so maybe a little inside baseball question. I know that React prefers F-word code words for projects. And so I'm curious, did this HTML effort have a F-word code word?
We like F-words. Okay. They're not four-letter words. Sure. So, I'm sure that some of you have heard of terms like fiber. In fact, it was actually in, a few talks here. But yeah, when we work on stuff before it's public, we want to be able to refer to it by some name. And so there's a long tradition of naming these things after the words that start with the letter F. And so, of course, this project also had an F-word project name. I actually kind of Easter egged it in my talk. I'm not sure. I think somebody laughed, so I think one person got it. But this project was called Float, and nice. The metaphor is things float to the head.
I love it. Let's applaud for that. That's good. That's a good one. I like it. Yes, we're forgetting about some of those F words today, actually. All right, so that's cool. Andrew, I'd like to talk with you next. So React has introduced a number of newer APIs. And so we've seen a handful of new APIs today around actions and use optimistic, and we've seen some form APIs kind of cropping in. And some of those are targeted at UI developers. Some of them are targeted at framework authors. And now I think we even have some that are like targeted by like compilers or like machines or whatnot. I'm curious, regarding the use optimistic and the form hooks, do you feel like those are things that developers should latch onto and use directly? Or if you have a framework that already provides optimizations or APIs for those things, should you use those at the framework level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's always a different, we'll have a different philosophy based on what the capability is that we're trying to add. So, and it's sort of a spectrum. So on the one side, I think a good example is use effect, right? Yeah. I think everyone nowadays kind of gets it when we say, ideally use effect would mostly be used by libraries, and you would pull it in very sparingly into your app code, not because it's impossible to use, but Sometimes it feels like it. And so that's an example of something where it's more on the side of, okay, this is designed to be a low-level hook. But then there's other things that are not that, like suspense. I would argue suspense is something you usually wouldn't put inside your libraries. That very much is something that the application author and even the designer would want to be able to coordinate at the top level. So but even that's a little complicated because suspense is the thing that enables streaming. So streaming is kind of a low-level thing in terms of implementation. So I don't think there's a clean answer, but I also think that the lines are going to blur a lot, especially now with the compiler.
Yeah.
Like as you say, there's going to be new capabilities that we add to React that developers never directly interact with themselves at all or write code for at all. It just kind of magically happens from the compiler. And we already have versions of this with frameworks like Next and Remix where they add optimizations using React features like the ones Josh showed, the preload stuff. If you're a Next user, you're probably never going to write preload at the top of you're not going to use that inline script thing or inline CSS thing. It's just going to happen automatically for you with Next. So that's a similar thing to the compiler where those things could be used perhaps manually, but they're really designed to be used with the framework or with the library in mind. So to address use optimistic specifically, I think that's another one that sort of bridges the gap or bridges both ends of the spectrum. Because we certainly designed it where we want it to address like the kind of basic entry-level cases, even slightly more sophisticated ones, like in Sam's talk where he was showing the optimistic shopping cart example. But there's a lot that goes into making actions and that pattern good. In the same way that there's a lot that goes into making a router good. And you can maybe spin some stuff up yourself, or you could like write your own, data library in an afternoon yourself. But is it gonna, do cache invalidation right? Is it gonna integrate with your routers correctly? Is it gonna account for, all of these cases that someone who, the folks who build React Query, for example, have been spending years thinking about that stuff. And same with Next and Remix and Redwood. So really. I think the best practice is still, even though you're using hooks like use optimistic, use action state, or actions in general, the idea is still that you're going to use those in combination with a sophisticated framework that has particular opinions. And there's not one way to do routing. There's not one way to do cache invalidation. Like, Next and Remix and Redwood are going to have different approaches to that. But the idea with actions is by providing the basic pattern and the core primitives in React that can really only be implemented at that level, or at least giving people the architecture, the framework, and using that in a slightly different way than we usually use those words, for how you should be thinking about how to structure your applications.
Yeah, I love that. So very much still on the train of React recommends a framework and probably prefer the framework tools, and then at some point the framework might adopt the
Yeah, am I allowed to say that without getting in trouble now?
I said it.
Yes.
Awesome.
I think one important point on the framework point, because it comes up a lot, is for almost every app, you're either using a framework or building a framework. And building a framework is really hard. I was watching Josh's talk today, and I've been following this work. I still don't understand it. It just takes so much effort and so much like wiring and consideration. Like if you're installing an app with React, first thing you're going to do is you're going to need routing, right? And then you're going to need data fetching, right? You're going to need to integrate all of these things that you're going to need to build an actual app. You end up building your own framework. And for a while there, we were publishing Create React App as a framework, but it just doesn't evolve with all of the new features that we're providing. And so the recommendation is use a framework or take it upon yourself to build a framework. And that's really a hard route and hard to get right, so rely on the experts. I think if you were to talk to framework authors at Next and at Remix and at Redwood and at Expo, they will tell you how much work goes into it. And how difficult it is. And one other point about the frameworks is that the frameworks that we recommend, I think all do a good job at letting you pick and choose certain features, right? So one of the memes that was out there when we made this recommendation is like, oh, React's telling us that we have to use a server now. It's not true. You could build spas with all of the frameworks that we recommend, right? So you can continue using your client-side app in any of those frameworks. One of the advantages of using one of those frameworks is that if you do want to start using server rendering in a particular new route or a high priority route, you can opt in on those particular routes and then gradually migrate your app to different patterns. And you get to pick and choose what you do. And if you want to build that picking and choosing yourself, that's an additional layer of complexity in building your own framework that you just don't want to have to deal with. And so I think it's great that there's so many options and so many frameworks out there where you can not have to build it yourself.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so cool to see so many of them at this conference show their plans for RSCs and kind of reintegrating into what you've been talking about for years in React development. Super cool. All right, we're getting low on time, so I want to continue forward. Now, there's no way that we got out of this without talking about signals. So we're going to talk about it now.
Sorry.
So React is really interesting because we've actually seen a lot of kind of casualties in the language, like from React, like object observe and like web components to some extent kind of lost a lot of momentum once React proved out this declarative UI authoring model. Now, conversely, signals have been gaining a lot of momentum. And so I think every non-React framework right now has some implementation of signals. I'm curious, like, will we see a React signal API, or is that kind of orthogonal to the way React works? This is for anyone who dares to pick it up.
I think Joe should go first.
Joe?
Why me? Yeah, where to begin? So let's start with the easy part of the question. So obviously, if signals were to become part of the spec, React supports JavaScript, so we would support signals. The most obvious thing would be the new use API lets you unwrap a promise, or it allows you to access context. Would be totally reasonable to have use accept a signal, right? And as that signal, publishes new values, then your component would update. Like that, obviously, if that becomes part of the spec, we'll support it. Whether we will see React actually adopting signals, different story. This is why they gave me the mic. So signals is really, show of hands, who's kind of familiar with the idea of signals? I'm just kind of curious. Okay, cool. So for those who are not, just very briefly, so you have some idea what we're talking about. So signals are an idea that goes back about 30, 40 years back to the early days of functional reactive programming research. The basic idea is that you have, you kind of build up a computation graph. You have these nodes that connect together, and at the kind of input to the graph, you have your sort of state. Things like state. And then you have derived computations. And then at the end, sort of on the outside of this, you then have places where you're using these values in your UI. So you kind of have this computation graph. If you're struggling to picture this, think back to in the keynote where we kind of showed the computation graph of what React compiler is doing, where we have things like song flowing in, or like songs flowing into filtered songs flowing into the UI. So that kind of a computation graph. And the idea with the signals-based framework is that you write code to manually construct this graph, and then the framework kind of manages updating it for you. So you're actually like, you're basically metaprogramming, where you're writing a program that produces a computation graph, which will then execute. So this means that things like if statements, early return, in particular like a conditional early return, doesn't quite work the way you expect, because now your return statement is running at the wrong point in the program. You're early returning in the meta program, not the real program. And if that sounds complicated, it's because it is complicated. We think that is a lot easier as developers to write first order programs where you just write your UI, right? You just write a function that describes the state of your UI. And then from that, we can extract out that computation graph and use that to optimize your application. So signals, if we were to explore them, it would be an implementation detail. We're not even sure that that's actually the most optimal implementation detail. Really, so it's great that other frameworks are exploring it. Genuinely mean that. Like, it's really great that there's so much exploration of different approaches in the ecosystem. But we don't think it's really the right fit for React as a programming model. We don't think it's like a great fit for the implementation. And in particular, just that ability to write code that describes the current state of the UI and think in that way is just so simple, and I think that's what's made React so approachable to so many developers. And the key thing is, as we showed in the compiler section, we just can take that information and optimize it under the hood. So hopefully that answers the question.
Can I add one more thing to this? I'll be brief because we got to make sure we talk to Dan a little bit too.
Yeah. I got a good one for Dan.
Okay. One reason I've seen people excited about signals, aside from just like the performance implications, is a lot of the other frameworks have seemed to be interested in this idea that if we can all agree on signals as the way our frameworks work, then there'd be better interop or something. We heard similar things from like the web components crowd for a while, and there are obviously selfish reasons why we're not as interested in that, because we're already doing pretty well for ourselves. But the less cynical answer is...
I thought you were worried about getting in trouble up here.
I had a drink earlier. But the less snarky answer is, React really does work differently than these other frameworks do, in a way that sometimes I feel like people don't appreciate. The concurrent stuff that we built, I know we went a little overboard hyping that stuff for so many years, but it's pretty cool. The optimistic feature, the use optimistic stuff that Sam was showing off, I think you'd have trouble implementing that in Signals, to be honest. That's the type of feature that once you play with it, I think you're going to realize, like, oh, this concurrent stuff, they weren't just speaking out of their ass. Like, there's something to this idea. And the compiler is built in such a way that makes the React model still work while also getting some of the same benefits as Signals, even though it isn't implemented in the exact same way. So we feel pretty confident in our strategy. Maybe we'll be eating crow in a few years when everyone else is off in Signals land and we're stuck with our stuff. But I think we're going to continue to rethink the best practices, and we're feeling pretty good about it.
Love that. All right, Dan. Great, nice. You didn't even get in trouble. You got applause for that one. That's amazing. All right, so Dan, this is a little bit more of a community-oriented question, and I feel like you're like the person best suited to answer this. But watching your talk, I felt like I understood for the first time kind of like how we got to RSCs. Right? There's been so much conversation about it, and it's been really hard to track, but like watching your talk, I was like, oh, like I see the logic behind it now. And I know that comes from a lot of hard work and open discussion and like open communication where you're not entirely sure how you're communicating this thing yet. And you do a masterful job of having that conversation openly and repeatedly, like over and over and over again, having that conversation. Now, I know that sometimes there's a tendency to, like, it's almost become a meme at this point to be like, oh, the React docs are Dan Abramow's timeline. And I know that that's not really fair to you because you're exploring these things and whatnot. This is a very long question, by the way, but I think it embodies a lot of us. Because you're exploring, you're trying to figure out how to talk about these things so that all of us can have a better onboarding experience. And React is this really interesting, like Seth said it before, like it's a really cool R&D project that gets tested at the scale of Meta, but a lot of these ideas are new and innovative. I'm curious, how would you like to see the community respond as we go into some of these new programming models? How can we best support the messaging of curiosity and learning in the open, being correctable, like as things get fleshed out in real time? Like, what are your thoughts around that? How can we better support curiosity and learning in public?
Ooh. I don't know.
That's all.
I think like one thing I've seen, and I've kind of gotten more like cynical over the years about this. I think like my cynical take is that I think for a lot of people, just like the abstraction level at which they got proficient just becomes kind of like a part of their identity, and then when there's like a new layer on top, I mean, a lot of new layers on top don't work out, right? So like a lot of people are just, oh, this is a fad. But some are actually good. And I think in a lot of cases what happens is just people kind of close themselves off to a bunch of stuff. And I think like with hooks, I think with hooks it was a bit easier. Like I think with hooks, there was a lot of controversy, and some people still hate them, but it's mostly settled. Whereas like with something like server components, I think it is very much controversial still. It's starting to settle a little bit, but you kind of have to like spend some time with it. And there's also like differences between, you try like a framework that's like not fully baked yet, but that's like a different from like the concept doesn't make sense. So I think like people have this like all this like different like experiences trying stuff. And what I'm saying is like, I think I've gotten more jaded about like, there is a lot of people you really can't convince about anything new, and that's fine. Like some of them will come around eventually, and like some will go to like greener pastures and like find something that they like more, and maybe someday they'll come back. But I've most consistently been kind of inspired by just like new people, like popping into the ecosystem. And like with hooks, like I remember like Nat Allison, she was like I think like she like tried to rewrite her like one of her projects with hooks like literally like on the day of the announcement, I think, like here at ReactConf, like the last time I was here, like in this venue, and that was just like exciting to watch. And I think like with server components, it's also been the case that there were like maybe like 3 or 4 people on Twitter who were like not negative about it. And like that was really like, that was actually like 2 of them are like in the front row here. And like the thing is like, it seems to be the case that like often this is like, some of these newer things, they land better with people who are just haven't been like exposed to a bunch of stuff before, and they're kind of like new to the industry, or maybe like have been here for a couple of years, but actually like their thinking is pretty clear, and they also don't have all this like baggage of opinions that like they're like they feel kind of they have like the need to defend, or they don't have this like things like their livelihood doesn't depend on a particular technology winning and stuff like this. So I think like I'm just always inspired by the new generation, and I mean that just sounds like I'm old, but I just feel like whoever comes the youth, yeah, like it's just like if you want to get in it, like go talk to the kids. That's not quite what I mean, but there's always and like people learn, like people who grew up with like this stuff. Like they're gonna have like different opinions than like people who grew up with like stuff from 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So you just find new people. Like it's fine. Somebody will like it maybe if it's good. Otherwise, yeah, that's kind of your problem.
Just find new people. Just find new people. I love it.
And Michael, if I can add on to that, because I think you asked a really important question: is how can the community help us? Mm-hmm. And I think like one thing you have to like keep in mind is that. And I think somebody said it earlier, is that React is a research project, right? And so when we also are building in public, right? And so we try to be very transparent and share what we're working on. One, because, mostly because it's gonna be in GitHub anyway. You're gonna have questions about it. But we try to be very open and build in public. And so when we do that, we start sharing our ideas. But because it's research, we don't really know the answers yet. Yeah. We're still discovering them and iterating and trying to innovate. And so I think the way that people can help is by really, when you're seeing what we're doing and what we're working on and what we're sharing, disambiguating like the state of what things are in, because I think there is this like cycle that gets created between like, you know, screenshotting pull requests and saying this new thing is coming in React, you got to learn it right now, and that creates a bunch of pressure for people to like start learning those things. But if it's very early on in the stage of that new feature, it's going to change a lot over the time. And as it's going through those different iterations, if you're trying to keep up with it, it's going to just be very confusing to try to keep up. And I love that there are so many great like educators in the community that are helping to teach people about what's coming in React. And I think the way that they can help is just helping to reinforce messages like this is experimental, this is still in research, and setting the expectation for what the state of these new features are whenever they share them.
Love that, thank you. So we're a little bit over time already, but I hope that you'll entertain me for one more question, and we'll try to do maybe like a speed round. You could like one word it or like, you know, one sentence it. And this is more like an existential question. We're gonna have you on stage without, you know, thinking about death and life and all that stuff. For one question, this one's for me. We've seen an explosion of AI, right? And so we've seen it writing components for us, right? Using some of these really cool, like amazing libraries like Radix. And now we have a compiler, so like robots know how to make that automatically generated code automatically efficient. And I'm curious, like, what does that leave us with? Does that, as like UI developers, does that push us more into the application stack? And I guess if you had one skill that you would recommend to everyone here as UI developers that they should, you know, sharpen up or let go or gain, what would it be? So that we can continue to come to this conference for the next 5 years, the next 10 years. What would that skill be?
Oh, I think my answer is like really kind of maybe pessimistic in the sense that like, yeah, let's just automate the whole thing. Like, and unfortunately, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know how to do anything else. So.
I like it. I like it. Find new friends. Automate your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should optimize everything, add PGO to our compiler, take advantage of AI, but I think as ultimately we're building for humans, right? And so I think that as developers in React, we need to keep, our superpower is being able to empathize with the human that's using this and building a delightful experience.
Love that.
Yeah, my answer is going to be very similar. Is you know, our goal has always been with React that we want you to be able to kind of push the code to the side and not, as much as possible, you want to be directly authoring the user experience. That's what you want it to feel like. You just drop a component in that describes the UI and then it happens. And really the ultimate version of that is just telling ChatGPT, build me an app. So like in spirit, it fits a lot. But the other thing is, I think the best React APIs have, I always feel like in this research project that we keep referring to, one of the things that feels like we're discovering is UX principles. Like suspense is an example of that. That really felt like a discovery when we landed on the design for suspense. And if you can detach yourself from the idea that you're a coder first and rediscover maybe your love for just really amazing UX and polish and how to build the most like kick-ass, like awesome apps that just feel really great when you open them up. And that, I mean, maybe that'll get replaced too, but I think that is the thing that in this AI-dominated world, we humans can contribute, perhaps.
Love that.
Yeah, I'm not so certain about exactly what the future of, you know, programming in an AI world will feel like, but you know, I've always been jealous of people who can like write C++. And I know there's still people out there who like write web apps in C++, and that seems like a crazy thing to do for me because I just wouldn't know how to approach that. But for the person who acquired that skill, that's a tool for them, they love it. And while maybe people start moving up the abstraction stack and start using AI to produce applications, you know, like 99% of what gets built is products or experiences. Like you build stuff because it's valuable, you don't build stuff because it's JavaScript. So, you know, there will be people who work in lower level languages forever, basically. At least that's my opinion. But it's okay if the sort of the shape of like what it means to build something changes and the tools you use change. And it's also okay if you use React in 20 years because you like it, even though that's like the C++ web app of today right now.
Love it.
I think to your question about like what we should do to prepare, I think definitely learn how to grow vegetables. Farming is probably gonna be very useful when the AIs take over. But more seriously, I think like you said what can we as UI developers do to prepare, and it got me thinking a lot about like yes, we are UI developers, but ultimately we are problem solvers, and AI is but yet another tool at our disposal to help us, build great experiences for people. So like whether you write your code in JavaScript or English, if you tell an AI to build it, like there's still that element of, you as an individual helping to problem solve, and I can't imagine AI doing that anytime soon, although I'm honestly not an AI expert, so maybe it is possible. But I do think that that's like a really important skill that we all bring. And so, yeah. But if not, farming, we need food.
Okay, I'm gonna actually, we're way over time. I'm getting some, hovering in the back. So I'm gonna have to cut you off, but find out what their secrets are to surviving the next, 10 years in this AI apocalypse. Hey, I hope that you will stand with me and just thank all of these incredible members of our community for the hard work that they've done. It's been an incredible day. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. We're gonna bring Ashley back out.